Okay.
Welcome everyone to a discussion about evaluation, and particularly we're going to be looking at fidelity. And within that concept, some of you may be thinking, well, why are we talking about fidelity? We're 3 years plus into this process. And the reason we're going to talk about it is because it's such an important topic. And you're also hearing a great deal about it during yesterday and through today's session, because you're going to hear about specific tools. Like yesterday, I know there was a discussion about the district fidelity tool and a state fidelity tool and the tiered fidelity inventory. So fidelity and implementation are extremely important things for us to consider. So we're going to talk about that today and give you some time to talk about how that process works. You can move the next slide. Here we go. So we're just going to give you a quick overview of the issue of fidelity. Then we're going to go into breakout sessions, and there are going to be some guided questions for you to consider and share. We want you to talk with your colleagues about this, and then we'll come back for a brief summary of what we're doing. So you know from your GIPR measures that there are some words in there that are common across all of those. Number. So there's a count aspect of the GIPR measures. There's also an emphasis on multi-tiered behavioral, or multi-tiered is in every one of those GIPR measures. But some other words that jump out at us are multi-tiered system, but the biggest ones are fidelity and implementation. So those are parts of those definitions, those measures that we have to attend to at the SEA level and the LEA level. And it's not just a count of the number of trainings or a count or number of percentage of schools that are implementing, but it's also a measure of fidelity. So each SEA and LEA school climate transformation grant needs to be looking at that issue of fidelity. So that's why we're going to talk about it and share it today. So one of the things that we talk about with the idea of fidelity is to look at, let's go to the next slide, please. Somehow it jumped. There we go. Fidelity is, these are just basic definitions, but they're pretty simple when you get through it. The degree to which the intervention or the program is implemented as planned, and it has to be informed by the research or the program developer. So if you're doing a program, a framework, an intervention, the question of fidelity is, are you doing it the way it was intended? Are you implementing the program the way it was planned? Then a related concept that I want you to think about in your discussions today are two related concepts. One of those is the concept of integrity. This is really about what matters most and what works best, and how do we adapt and look at local needs and circumstances. Integrity is not something you normally say, well, we're going to take this tool that has fidelity with it, we're going to change it completely around. Integrity is like in thinking in the idea of implementation science, it's the idea of once you've started to innovate, once you have fidelity, you have to then look and say, okay, this part doesn't work as well in our schools or with our students or with our district or state. We want to adapt it and see if it still continues to be more effective. So first you get fidelity, then you begin to look at that integrity. Did you adapt the program to the context and to have better outcomes, to make it better than it was before? And then the final concept to think about is accuracy. That's what is your measurement system for looking at fidelity of implementation. What are you using as a calculation? What are you really looking at, and is it accurate? Do you have correct values or a standard? Was the measurement true? Was it correct? In other words, you can have a score on a tiered fidelity inventory, but it really reflect what was happening, or was it just a number? So it's important for us to think about, are the things we're doing now in 3 or 4 or 5 years of implementation of strategies within these projects, are we getting to the point where we're having some fidelity that we can measure, but also looking at integrity? What do we have to adapt, and is it still working? And then also, are our numbers accurate? It doesn't make much sense to report fidelity measures if they're not accurate measures. Turn this on over to Steve now.
Yeah, thank you, Don. So it's a pleasure to be with you all here. As we're talking, we'd like to point out there's kind of 3 takeaways. First is, as Don was talking, we need to implement effective practices to produce meaningful outcomes. So if we implement that, we want to make sure it's done correctly and consistently, getting at accuracy, fidelity. We also want to measure fidelity to determine how well we are implementing, just to get a gauge of where we're at and where we need to be. And finally, all this is more than just measuring, right? We need to do something with that. We need to improve our fidelity through supportive systems. So when you look at this slide here, it's getting at the idea that why is it important? Because again, if we want to produce meaningful outcomes, we need to implement with fidelity. So a poorly implemented program can lead to failure just as easily as a poorly designed one. So we have to focus on, are we doing the right thing in the right way? We know that a lack of implementation fidelity might result in a practice being less effective, less efficient, produce less predictable responses. So we really want to guard against false starts. And false starts meaning like, yeah, we tried this, but it didn't work. Well, we have to focus on, are we doing, again, the right thing in the right way to produce those outcomes? And certainly, when programs are implemented with fidelity compared to programs that are not, the difference is effectiveness is profound. So that gets at, when we look at student outcomes, we often will look at those that in groups. So we might compare one school as implementing a fidelity compared to another group that is not implementing fidelity, just to really gauge how effective the program is. So on the next slide, when we look at this, we also know from the work of Jessica Swain-Bradway and Jen Freeman that initial findings that almost at fidelity is not enough. And what we mean by this is there's like a threshold effect. So there's a myth that Phil Strain talks about, that for every increment in fidelity that we have, every improvement in fidelity, people tend to look like we have equal increments of outcomes, meaningful outcomes. The reality is, until you hit a threshold, you probably won't see those outcomes. So that has implications on how we communicate this, but also has greater implications on how do we support to make sure we are getting those outcomes. And then on the next slide, so when we looked at the main points here, we said it's important to implement things correctly and consistently with fidelity, but we also need to look at other functions of fidelity. So it determines the quality of the program. Fidelity can also help us to prompt teams to use for decision points to make sure that we are, looking at data, moving in the right direction, always focusing on continuous improvement. The fidelity measures, as fidelity assessment, also really can help a team build fluency with critical features of what a multi-tiered behavioral framework would involve. And it helps us to prevent implementation drift. So right now, as we are in several years of implementation, we know that we've had changeover in staff. We had different students who are being worked with. We're in a pandemic. So we want to make sure that we are still adhering to critical features of the work. And that's where the fidelity helps us out. And finally, is providing performance feedback. So when we can look at fidelity measures, we can go back and say, this is what is working well. You're doing this correctly. You're doing this consistently. You're doing accurately. Which provides better performance feedback than just say good job, things are looking good. So, and then the next slide, what we have planned is that Brian, you'll be sending people into different breakout sessions, but we like the facilitators to help guide these questions. So for each of you all, what we like to say is, what are the ways you're measuring fidelity? How are you using fidelity to improve your program? And then what might you need to help measure fidelity or use the data for improving implementation efforts? So we've got some time for you around those three questions. And Brian, I'm going to pass it back to you for the next steps here.
Okay. I probably need about 2 minutes to finish setting up these rooms, and then I'm going to open them. You should be placed into your room automatically. And then for our TA partners, just go ahead and identify yourself once you're in the room. And then we'll be good to go. So I'm going to go on mute, and if everybody could just, think amongst yourselves for about 2 minutes here, we'll be ready to go.
Just a prompt to all of the participants. Once we go into the breakout rooms, we'll lose the visual of the slide. And I see Steve just put them in chat as well. You might want to copy those over somewhere. And also our TA providers will have them so we can help prompt the discussion.
We really hope that this is an opportunity for folks to share what they're doing and get some feedback and ideas from other individuals and other states, other SEAs, other LEAs. So we hope that you take advantage of this time to really talk to your colleagues.
Hey, Don, how many minutes are you giving us in the breakouts?
I think it was about 35 or something along those lines.
Okay.
Depends on when we get in there, but I think Brian's getting us there. So you'll have a countdown thing to bring you back with 5 minutes sparing in our session. So.
I was wondering if there's any questions in the meantime that Don can answer for you around Fidelity. Don, I don't see anything in the chat right now.
No, but if any questions do come up, ask those within your breakout sessions, because those people might actually be able to answer those questions really well. So those are your facilitators are well versed in the area of Fidelity. All right, you're getting some good questions already coming in. What are some ways you measure the fidelity of your acknowledgement system? Fidelity, just another F word. Yep. We've got to make sure we have some real clear. I think the idea is some ways to measure the acknowledgement system. That's a good one to share if we don't get, Brian, if we can talk about it if you want. Okay. So what do people do in their fidelity, their measurement system? We've had systems where we will keep track of rewards or recognitions that are sent out. We select, we have monitors and other individuals that might go through the school to make sure that students are being recognized in all the appropriate locations within the school that need to be addressed. So I think there are different ways. There's maybe not a standardized instrument that's been developed, but there are ways to circulate, to record, to prompt, or to even measure the use of a recognition system. We've had some schools that have used tokens to acknowledge students, and they've simply gathered those up every week and weighed them, put them in a measurement so we can see how many did we give out this week. And we're able to show the incremental success of the implementation of recognizing students by actually keeping track of what was turned in by the students throughout the week, or a portion of that was kept by the record of that kept by the teachers and personnel within the school. So it would be good when we go to the breakout sessions if we have some examples that other folks have used to address those within a PBIS system.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and open those rooms. If you're not placed into a breakout, I'll be here with you still. We have some names we'll have to get confirmation on, but go ahead and accept the rooms. Perfect, here we are. All right, Steve and Donnie back in the main room?
Yes, yep.
Okay.
So thank you. We had wonderful discussions, so thank you for the opportunity to set this up and talk about these questions. A lot of good information shared. So in summary, if you could go on to the next slide, Brian. Yeah, so we talked about some main points that were discussed, in the meeting. The takeaway that we're hoping that you would have here is that one, we need to implement effective practices with fidelity to produce meaningful outcomes. The second thing is that we need to measure to see where we're at. And we had a lot of good discussion where, where we're at right now certainly has been affected by challenges with pandemic as well as other things happening. And finally, we need to improve fidelity through supportive systems. So how do we act on the data? How do we support to make sure it's moving forward? If you have questions, please reach out to your TA provider. Wonderful resources are available. Reach out to other colleagues who you've just been talking with as well. Finally, there's some additional resources on the PBIS.org. There's a tiered fidelity inventory. There's a tier 1 benchmarks of quality, and there's an evaluation blueprint that would help provide information on how do you collect this information and act upon it in a meaningful manner. So Don, would you add anything more?
I just say there are lots of tools that are available from the Center on PBIS, and these are just some that are there. But you've heard about the DSFI, you've heard about the SSFI, you've heard about variations of the tiered fidelity inventory. So I think one of the main things is you can explore those on the website, but you can also talk to the TA provider associated with your state or your LEA and explore some ideas on what your needs might be.
You all?
I think that's it.
Yeah.
Okay. We have a few extra minutes here, so I'm going to put the instructions for break in chat. Go ahead and turn off your video if you would like. We're going to come back at 10 minutes past the hour. So stand and stretch and get refreshed.